In 2001, Billy Beane, the general manager of the Oakland Athletics baseball team, started buying cheap unwanted players against the advice of every expert around him. The system he followed would soon reshape every major team sport. You're watching Based on True Events, and today I'm going to tell you the real story behind the film Moneyball. We'll compare the movie to the real facts and find out which important details were left out. Don't worry if you know nothing about baseball or sports in general. The Oakland Athletics scouts Billy Beane argued with so desperately would probably say you don't belong here. But trust me, this story is really about misconceptions, stubbornness and the courage to challenge decade-old traditions. Enjoy the video. Let's start with Billy Beane himself. There's a reason he's played by Brad Pitt. Billy really was good looking, and for baseball scouts in the 1970s evaluating young Beane, that actually mattered. These scouts, usually older men, saw themselves as true experts, and they paid attention to appearance, facial features, even things like good baseball face, which was supposedly a sign of a strong character. In the movie, we repeatedly see flashbacks of scouts offering the talented young Billy professional contracts and huge amount of money. That part is true. Most prospects, as young recruits are called, usually have 2 or 3 standout qualities, while scouts hope they can develop another skill later. But Billy Beane already had everything. On top of that, he excelled in basically every sport he played. At Stanford, where he planned to study, Billy was offered a combined scholarship for both baseball and football. The idea was that he would play for both teams. Billy wanted an education, so when the time came to choose between a professional baseball career and college, the decision wasn't easy. When the New York Mets came to San Diego for an away game, Billy was invited into the locker room. There was even a jersey with his name on it, and the players already knew who he was. Beane came from a middle-class military family and had barely traveled anywhere. To him, the Mets weren't just baseball stars, they felt distant, almost mythical. After getting that close to the dream, Billy couldn't resist. He chose professional baseball and accepted a check for $125,000. But almost immediately, he started doubting the decision. For the first time in his life, he had chosen money over what he truly wanted. Years later, he would promise himself never to make that kind of choice again. So, in 1980, the Mets drafted Billy Beane as a future superstar. Tall, athletic, charismatic, with a beautiful mechanics and movie star looks. He spent the next 4 years in the minor leagues developing his game, which was completely normal, although players with his talent sometimes reached the majors much faster. The problem was that he never dominated the minors. He played fine, just nowhere near the impossible expectations everyone had for him. In 1984, he finally made his MLB debut, the highest level of professional baseball. He played as an outfielder, but his performances in the majors weren't impressive either. Over his career, he played 148 games and moved through 4 different teams, the last of which was Oakland Athletics. The numbers were disappointing. He was batting under 220 while stars usually hit above 300. He only hit 3 home runs in his entire career. He never became a star, not even a reliable everyday player. The scouts had been wrong about him. At the high school level, everyone was blown away by his physical tools, his mechanics, how dominant he looked in practice, but they didn't pay enough attention to one thing: how effective Billy actually was during real games. In 1990, Billy Beane entered the season as a backup outfielder for the Oakland Athletics, but instead of walking into the field, he walked into the front office and said he wanted to work as a scout. The scout's job was to travel ahead of the team and analyze the strengths and weaknesses of upcoming opponents. Nobody in the Athletics front office had ever played in the major leagues. Most people would have given anything to be in Billy's position, and he was throwing it away for an ordinary scouting job. Over the next few years, Billy worked in the Oakland Athletics front office and slowly climbed the organization. At the time, the general manager was Sandy Alderson. Alderson had come to believe that everything in baseball, from in-game strategy to player evaluation, should be approached scientifically, by forming hypotheses and testing them against historical statistical data, instead of relying on the collective wisdom of the old baseball establishment. But back then, the team still had wealthy ownership, one of the best payrolls in baseball, the strong results on the field. There was no reason to break what already worked, so all those ideas about analytics mostly stayed on paper and inside the farm system. The major league team remained fully under the control of manager Tony La Russa. But when the club changed owners and the budget was cut, La Russa left. The team hired Howe to help implement the front office ideas built around advanced metrics and undervalued statistics. In 1993, Alderson promoted Billy to assistant general manager and tasked him with finding undervalued players. He also showed him the works of club analyst Eric Walker. For the first time, Billy saw an objective way of looking at baseball. Beane wanted to learn more, so Alderson pointed him toward a stack of worn-out books written by a man named Billy James, the person who completely changed the way he thought about baseball. Alderson had collected almost everything that James had ever written, including 4 self-published books from 1977 to 1980 that existed only as cheap photocopies. Who exactly was this Bill James? Well, technically, he was a night watchman at Ken Beane's factory. On the side, he was obsessed with baseball statistics. His first book, Baseball Abstract 1977, featuring 18 categories of statistical information that you just can't find anywhere else, was completely self-published, printed, photocopied, and stapled together by hand, just 68 pages long. To sell it, James placed a tiny advertisement in the Sporting News magazine. Only 75 people bought the book. In that first abstract, James argued that concept of defensive error when a player fails to catch a ball shouldn't even count as a real statistic, because it's based entirely on someone's opinion about what should have happened. For example, if a ball isn't hit anywhere near a player and he never even attempts to field it, he won't be charged with an error. But the player who positioned himself correctly almost made the play but failed, he gets punished with an error. At the same time, James argued that simply watching games with your eyes isn't enough to reliably tell a good player from a bad one. The difference between a hitter batting 300 and one batting 270 is basically one extra hit every couple of weeks. If you only watch part of the season, you probably won't even notice the difference and you might actually prefer the worst player. But over a full season, those 3% become massive. The core idea of the book was this: baseball statistics are not pure achievements of one person against another, they are a result of a player interacting with circumstances. In 1978, Bill James released his second baseball abstract, and this time he left modesty behind. The subtitle read, "The second annual edition of baseball's most informative and imaginative review." In it, he tried to measure exactly how much every action on the field contributed to scoring runs, even introducing actual mathematical formulas to calculate player value. This time, 250 people bought the book. Trying to spread his theories and find like-minded people, James constantly wrote letters to anyone who might listen. One of the people he contacted was software developer Pete Palmer. Later, Palmer would help create one of the most widely used offensive stats in baseball today, OPS, on base plus slugging. Over the time, Bill James managed to build an entire movement around his ideas. Scientists from major corporations, university professors, statisticians, Wall Street analysts, lawyers, and mathematicians started sending him their own ideas, models, and questions. And most importantly, these people started collecting entire new kinds of data during games. The movement, James called Project Scoresheet, eventually merged with a small company called Stats Inc. Starting in 1981, they began sending their own statisticians to MLB games. These people tracked out not only the standard stats everyone already used, but also information nobody had ever systematically collected before. But the people running professional baseball teams saw no value in any of it. When Stats Inc. offered teams access to this new data, even for free, almost nobody cared. By 1985, Stats Inc. stopped trying to sell data to baseball clubs and started selling it directly to fans instead. Bill James finally became known to the general public thanks to journalist Dan Okrent. Okrent played in an early version of what we now call fantasy baseball, and he happened to be one of the 75 people who bought James' very first booklet. "I was stunned," Okrent later said. "I couldn't believe that a person like this existed and nobody knew who he was." Okrent wrote an article about James for Sports Illustrated. At first, the article was rejected. The traditional ideas about baseball were treated like unquestionable facts, and evidence against them simply wasn't welcome in print. A year later, the article was finally published, and James suddenly became known to a much wider audience. Then, in 1982, Ballantine Books released Baseball Abstract nationwide and it became a bestseller. But people inside baseball still ignored his ideas. James titled his final essay in the last Baseball Abstract, "Breaking the Vent." "There is a wonderful feeling," he wrote, "in knowing that you're right and the world is wrong." Let's get back to Billy Beane. In 1997, Sandy Alderson was promoted to the MLB Central Office and Billy Beane took over as general manager of the Oakland Athletics. By that point, Billy had already read all 12 of Bill James' abstracts. During his first years as general manager, Beane still trusted his scouts. He even allowed them to independently sign players in the later rounds of the draft. If you are not familiar with how the American draft system works, it's the mechanism through which clubs select young players from colleges and high schools. Teams pick one after another, with the weakest team selecting first. The idea is to balance the league. The draft is the main way teams rebuild their rosters, and it's where the future of franchise is decided. Then came the 2001 draft, which turned into a disaster for the Athletics. The best players they planned to select were all taken before Oakland's turn. The only names left were players the scouts liked, but Billy didn't. In the middle of that chaos, Grady Fuson, the club's scouting director, selected a high school pitcher named Jeremy Bonderman. He had a blazing fastball, beautiful mechanics, and the kind of body that looked perfect in a baseball uniform. Exactly the kind of arguments Billy had spent years trying to train his scouts to ignore. Billy knew that high school pitchers reached the major leagues about half as often as college pitchers did. The odds were against this kid. To understand the atmosphere, on draft day, the scouting room in Oakland was almost ceremonial. Wives, owners, and the friends of the owners politely stood along the back wall, watching the Oakland Athletics decide their future. And at that moment, when Grady leaned toward the phone to announce Bonderman's name, Billy exploded. He jumped out of his chair, grabbed the phone, and hurled it straight into the wall. That was the moment Billy realized he could no longer rely on his scouts and their way of evaluating players. And now we finally arrive at the events of the movie itself. That season, the Athletics had a strong regular season, but lost to the New York Yankees in the playoffs. Billy was devastated by the idea that rich teams always beat poor mid-market clubs like Oakland when it's mattered most. At one scouting meeting, Billy showed up with a new assistant, Harvard graduate Paul DePodesta. Paul had never played baseball in his life, he was an economist. He quietly took his seat and opened up his laptop. In the movie, his character is renamed Peter Brandt. The film also dramatizes things by showing Billy stealing Paul away from another team. In reality, DePodesta had already been working in the Athletics since 1999. Before that, he simply had no real influence in decision-making. Another major distortion in the movie is the idea that Paul opened Billy's eyes on analytics. As you already know, Billy had been obsessed with Bill James' theories for years. What bothered Grady Fuson most was Paul's computer. "What do you even need that thing for?" he asked after one meeting, almost as if he sensed the machine itself was threatening his authority. "You sit there with your computer and I don't even know what you're doing." "I'm just looking at statistics," Paul answered. Statistics gave him entirely new ways to understand amateur players. Coaches and scouts constantly made subjective judgments based on their own personal experiences, assuming those experiences represented reality, even when they didn't. Second, people focus far too much on recent performance. What a player did yesterday doesn't necessarily predict what he'll do tomorrow. And third, and maybe most importantly, people trusted their eyes too much whenever they saw something flashy or dramatic on the field. But in baseball, many of the most important things are invisible if you are just simply watching the game. For Billy Beane, though, it was less theoretical and more instinctive. He wanted to take decision-making power away from the scouts, and Paul was the tool that allowed him to do it. Grady ignored Paul's request to scout players the computer kept recommending. One of those players was Kevin Yolkelis. Overweight, slow, weak throwing arm, why would anyone bother scouting him? Just 3 months later, Yolkelis had the second best on-base percentage in all of professional baseball. Or take Kirk Saarloos, a short right-hander with an average fastball. 1 year later, he became one of only 2 players from his draft class to reach MLB within a single season. Eventually, Grady realized his own position inside the organization was becoming unstable. so he decided to play along with management and remembered a player named David Beck, a guy no MLB team had drafted, but one Paul DePodesta had repeatedly suggested scouting. Grady signed him. Beck had an extremely awkward pitching motion. Scouts even nicknamed him the Creature. But once the Creature stepped onto the field, he completely dominated the Arizona Rookie League and made the All-Star team. It became the first successful signing based on Paul's computer-driven recommendations. But for Grady, it was already too late. The veteran scouting director was demoted and Billy replaced him with Eric Kubota, a young scouting director from Berkeley who, just like Paul, had never played baseball, which for Billy Beane was almost a qualification rather than a problem. After the 2001 season, the Athletics lost all three of their key players to richer teams. Jason Giambi signed with New York Yankees for $120 million over 7 years. Johnny Damon joined the Boston Red Sox for $32 million over 4 years. Jason Isringhausen signed with St. Louis Cardinals for $28 million over 4 years. Their combined yearly salaries were almost equal to the entire Athletics payroll. But losing those players also came with one advantage. In addition to their own draft picks, the Athletics received compensatory picks from the three teams that signed away their stars. So, the scouting room before the 2002 draft. The scouts had assembled a list of 680 prospects. The selection process worked roughly like this. Eric Kubota would call out a name from the board. Whoever had seen the player in person would give their opinion, and little by little the list would shrink. The scouts had their own vocabulary for warning signs: not too bright, bad but manageable, soft, which could mean both out of shape and mentally weak, but bad makeup, that was basically a death sentence. The phrase could mean anything: criminal records, alcohol problems, personality disorders. The important part was simple: this guy comes with problems we don't want to deal with. Whenever they labeled someone as bad makeup, they pinned up a photo of Milo, a former employee everybody hated. They checked the result of psychological test MLB gave to all draft prospects. They even talked about how much influence a player girlfriend had over him. Billy barely participated in these discussions about character. Paul didn't say anything at all. Most of the early meetings were spent cutting down the original list of 680 players. Aside from criminal history, attachment to girlfriends, or other signs of bad makeup, the Oakland Athletics had only two automatic disqualifiers. The first was age. With very few exceptions, the new scouting director immediately threw all high school players into the discard pile. The second was signing bonus expectations. The Athletics simply didn't have the money. On the whiteboard next to Billy there was room for 60 names. Only one line has been filled in: Swisher. He was a rare point of agreement between Paul's computer and the instincts of the old school scouts. He had the natural athleticism scouts loved, but he also had the numbers Billy and Paul valued most. He drew more walks than almost anyone. One by one, Billy took the names of players the old scouts had fallen in love with and, using Paul's statistics, tore apart their weaknesses. Billy himself had once been the dream prospect old school scouts fantasized about, so he knew exactly what their judgment was worth. Again and again, the scouts would say things like, "He's got a great body," and every single time Billy answered, "We're not selling jeans here." One by one, the scouts' favorites vanished from the whiteboard until it was nearly empty. Then Billy wrote another name on the board. The old scouts had no idea who he was. Eric had to flip through several pages of reports before finding him. Left-handed hitter, throws right, good plate approach, not much power yet, our kind of player. He takes pitches. "Why haven't we talked about this guy before?" one of the older scouts asked. "He is a corner position player who doesn't hit many home runs," Eric replied. After a long pause, Eric finally said, "I hate to say this, but if we're talking about the next Jason Giambi, this might be him." Then Billy Beane picked up the marker again and wrote another name: Brown. The fourth scout sitting across from him either laughed or grimaced. Brown? He had barely made anyone's master list of prospects. Brown was one of countless players scouts viewed at best as future minor leaguers. Only 3 old school scouts had ever seen him play, and every single one of them ranked nearly 1,000 players above him. Billy could have listed 10 different statistical reasons why Brown was a serious prospect. He had studied how players' numbers evolved from high school all the way to professional baseball. But Billy constantly told Paul that if you tried explaining probability theory to baseball people, you'd only confuse them. Using the data from Paul's laptop, Billy was dismantling the authority of the system that had ruled baseball for decades. At one point, he seriously considered firing all the scouts entirely and drafting players straight from the computer data. Traditional scouts loved evaluating high school athletes with their eyes, but Paul focused much more heavily on college players because there was far more reliable statistical data available on them. Even Bill James, the author of the Baseball Abstract, had never really attempted to show how high school or college statistics could reliably predict professional success. But Paul DePodesta, now the head of research and development, conducted his own study. Eric then turned to Bogey, the oldest scout in the room, a living legend, and asked whether he believed in the new system. Bogey was one of the scouts who 20 years earlier had dreamed of signing Billy Beane himself, and he knew how the dream had ended. Now he looked at the board and realized there was nobody like Billy on it anymore, and he quietly admitted, "This is a new game." The rest of the scouts stayed silent, but they understood they were no longer there to make decisions, they were there to watch decisions being made. Then Paul read out another list of 8 players he and Billy wanted to consider. None of them impressed the scouts. Most of them the scouts had never even heard of. On the morning of the draft, the younger scouts arrived at the office and reported back their negotiations with players. Technically, teams weren't allowed to discuss contracts ahead of time, but everyone did it anyway. The players they had spoken to expected to be selected near the very end of the draft in the late rounds, though they agreed relatively tiny signing bonuses. For example, Oakland planned to sign one second-round player for just $200, even though second-round picks usually received well over $1 million. And this wasn't simply about saving money, it was literally the maximum Billy could afford to pay. When Oakland's future draft picks found out they were about to be selected ahead of some of the most desired prospects in the country, many of them thought it was a prank call. The Athletics had a reputation as a farm system for richer teams, so whenever Oakland showed interest into a player, people paid attention. That's why maintaining the illusion was crucial. Athletics had to make it seem like they were only targeting those players because they were cheap. If other teams realized Oakland actually valued them because of their performance, they would immediately start competing with them and drive up the price. There were exceptions, of course, players like Nick Swisher, whom plenty of teams wanted besides Billy. And everything suggested another club would grab him first. Every team enters the draft with its own strategy, but those plans depend heavily on what other teams decide to do. Once one team's draft plan collapses, the entire chain reaction can fall apart. If Billy didn't get Swisher, he'd pivot to another player and suddenly somebody else's strategy would collapse too. That's why general managers spend the entire draft constantly calling each other trying to figure out who planned to take whom. Out of 20 players, Billy could realistically afford he hoped to land maybe 6. By Oakland's second selection, the 24th overall pick, the entire board could already be empty. If they somehow managed to get 6 of their guys, it would be unbelievable. No team had ever drafted 6 players from its own top 20 list. Unlike the NFL or NBA, where the draft is treated like a giant television event, the MLB draft was basically just a massive conference call between front offices. The Pittsburgh Pirates, the worst team from the previous season, picked first. Billington Bryan. Just like that, $4 million disappeared. Then the next 5 teams at the bottom of the standings all selected high school players, which made Billy very happy because in his mind that was the biggest mistake possible. Every player he didn't want being drafted increased the odds of getting the players he did want. Then the Milwaukee Brewers selected Prince Fielder with their 8th pick, and the entire Oakland room exploded with excitement. The chain reaction they needed was still intact. Every team ahead of Oakland got the player they wanted and stayed away from everyone else's plans, which meant the Athletics got Nick Swisher with their first pick. One name down from Billy's top 20 wishlist. Soon after, the other teams grabbed 3 more players from Billy's board. 16 remained. The Athletics' next picks were 24, 26, 30, 35, 37 and 39. With the 24th overall pick, Oakland planned to select John McCurdy. Then, White Sox interfered. "They're about to take Blanton," Billy said. Then, the White Sox voice came from the speakerphone. "The White Sox select Roger Ring." "You gotta be kidding me!" Billy shouted in excitement. "We take Blanton at 24 and McCurdy at 26. Somehow, they had just landed another player Billy was certain would be gone before their turn. I'm not going to walk through every moment of the draft, but here's the result. Under normal circumstances, Billy would have considered getting even 3 players from his personal top 20 as a massive success. By the end of the draft, the Athletics had selected 13. "We just drafted 2 or 3 best right-handed pitchers in the country and 2 of the best position players," Paul said. But here's the important part. Maybe 2 or 3 of those 13 players were truly desired by other teams. The rest looked valuable only if you trusted Paul's statistical models. Oakland drafted players their own scouts described as too short, too skinny, too fat, too slow. But the statistics, the numbers nobody except Oakland cared about, said these players produced results. And the most importantly, these overlooked players came incredibly cheap. At the end of the day, Billy finally leaned back, smiled widely and said, "This is probably the most fun day I've ever had in baseball." All the talent they had just drafted would reach the major league roster for years. Most of them still needed several seasons in the minors. And the stars Oakland has lost, they needed replacing immediately. Oakland used statistics and mathematics for much more than just drafting players. Before the 2002 season, Paul DePodesta calculated how many wins were typically needed to reach the playoff, 95. Then he calculated how many more runs a team needed to score than allow in order to win 95 games. The answer was roughly plus 135 runs. The previous season, Oakland had won 102 regular season games, an incredible result, but the 2002 team entered the season without 3 players the market considered among the best in baseball, and according to Paul's predictions, that alone meant about 7 fewer wins, which put them right on the edge of missing the playoffs. Losing Jason Isringhausen wasn't viewed as a major problem. His role could be trained into another player fairly easily. Teams paid huge money for his traditional stats, even though Oakland's models suggested those stats didn't impact winning nearly as much as people thought. Losing Johnny Damon was different. As a center fielder and leadoff hitter, Damon left 2 holes behind him, defense in center field and offensive production at the top of the lineup. His departure mattered, just not $32 million worth on mattering. But the biggest loss by far was Jason Giambi. According to Paul's model, offensive contribution mattered more than defensive contribution. Giambi may have been one of the worst defensive first basemen in the league, but he was also one of the most efficient offensive players in baseball. So the Athletics had to search for replacements through trades, looking for players other teams were willing to give up. And this was exactly where the statistical approach became powerful. The Oakland front office quickly realized they couldn't replace Giambi with 1 player. Players like that barely existed. Even if they did, Oakland couldn't afford them. "It's not about replacing 1 player," Billy Beane would later say. "It's about replacing the aggregate of what he does." He couldn't buy another Giambi, but he could break Giambi down into pieces and buy those most valuable parts much cheaper. "We don't get perfect players," Paul said. "There has to be something wrong with them for us to get them." Take Tim Hudson for example. He was born with deformities in both feet. As a child, he underwent surgeries, but he still limped badly and walked with a duck-like gait. And somehow he turned that into an advantage. His unusual mechanics gave the ball incredible movement and spin. To fill the Giambi hole, Oakland acquired 3 players most teams didn't want: former Yankee outfielder David Justice, former Red Sox catcher Scott Hatteberg, and Jason's younger brother Jeremy Giambi. They were available only because each of them were considered flawed. David Justice had once been one of the biggest stars in baseball, a player Oakland never could have afforded in his prime, but now he was considered washed up at the end of his career. Oakland didn't care. If numbers still said he produces runs, that was enough. Jeremy Jambi suffered from the same weaknesses as his older brother: poor speed and weak defense, which made him heavily undervalued. And Scott Hatteberg, who would play a special role in this story, had suffered a serious injury that left him unable to throw properly from the catcher position. He needed to learn an entirely new role on the field. Coach Wash had about 6 weeks to turn Scott Hatteberg into Oakland's starting first baseman. The movie dedicates several scenes to that transformation. "I figured if I was terrible at first base, they'd just release me," Hatteberg later said, and he was terrible, but they didn't release him. Playing first base had almost nothing to do with why Oakland wanted Scott Hatteberg in the first place. The fact that he eventually became good there was just a nice bonus. What really mattered was something else. He exhausted opposing pitchers. His at-bats were incredibly long, almost as long as Jason Jambi's, even though pitchers feared him far less. It was a subtler, less visible advantage. He wasn't afraid of strikeouts. In baseball, after 3 failed attempts to hit the ball, the batter is out. But when Hatteberg was down to 2 strikes, 1 swing away from the failure, he stayed unusually calm. And in these situations, he actually hit better than most players. He had an almost supernatural ability to put the bat on the ball, not necessarily crush home runs, just make contact. Hatteberg even tracked his own at-bats manually. He studied which pitches he handled well, which one he missed, and he only swung the pitches that fit him. At the end of the season, Paul DePodesta calculated something remarkable. If Scott Hatteberg had taken every at-bat for the entire Oakland lineup, the team would have scored between 940 and 950 runs, roughly the same offensive production they got from stars like Miguel Takeda and Eric Chavez. Statistics are also important for our channel, by the way. If you leave a like and a comment, it genuinely helps us grow. Thank you. The roster was assembled and the season began. Remember, Paul had calculated that reaching the playoffs required plus 135 runs and about 95 wins. Then, based on historical data from the players Oakland already had, he projected future performance. Assuming no major injuries, the team was expected to score between 800 and 820 runs, while allowing somewhere around 650–670. That translated to a projection of 93 to 97 wins and playoff appearance. In reality, the Athletics ended the season scoring exactly 800 runs and allowing 653, an incredibly accurate prediction over a 162-game season. And the front office also used statistics to improve the quality of the play on the field itself. Players were broken down into components: no heart, no grit, no winner mentality, just numbers and productive actions. Based on those numbers, players were told exactly what to do and what not to do. And usually those instructions didn't come from the manager. Here we run into probably the biggest and the most important difference between the movie and reality. In the film, the manager supposedly refused to let Billy influence the lineup or anything happening on the field. The idea was, you build a team, I manage it. The movie also suggests Billy kept emotional distance from players so it would be easier to trade or release them later. Both of those ideas are completely wrong. Normally, a general manager is a distant figure. He shakes your hand when you sign, maybe calls you when you get traded, and that's it. Billy was the opposite. David Justice once said he saw Billy more in half a season than all his previous general managers combined. A player might run into Billy in the clubhouse, interrogating a pitcher about why he threw a certain pitch, or in the hallway, aggressively confronting a bench player over comments made to the media, or inside the video room, drenched in sweat after walking out, throwing things around because the team was playing badly. Most general managers had never played professionally themselves and felt uncomfortable around players. Billy was different. His entire presence basically said, "I've been exactly where you are, so don't act like stars around me." He wasn't looking for friendship, he wasn't collecting autographs, he kept emotional distance even standing right next to people. But he was everywhere except one place, the dugout. League rules prohibited general managers from entering it during games, but even there, Billy's presence was still felt. Manager Art Howe managed games as if a tiny Billy Beane were sitting on his shoulder, screaming directly into his ear. Very quickly, every new Oakland player realized one thing: Billy Beane controlled everything. He was like a Hollywood producer who doesn't just interfere with the script, but also with the lighting, the camera, the costumes, and the set design. He didn't just make trades, oversee scouts, and speak to the media. He decided when the team should bunt or steal a base, who played and who stayed on the bench, who batted and in what order, how the bullpen was used, and even which psychological tricks the manager should use on the players. If you watched Athletics games closely, you could notice something strange. Manager Howe always stood several steps above the players in the dugout, chin raised, staring thoughtful into the distance. No manager in baseball projected more authority or control simply through body language. In reality, it was all theater. Billy had literally instructed Howe where he had to stand during games, so the players would look up at him and felt confident. Because when Howe sat on the bench the way he naturally preferred, he looked, according to Billy, like a prisoner of war. One anonymous player once asked what would change if Art Howe got fired. He answered, honestly, nothing. Billy already runs the team from the weight room anyway. And speaking of the weight room, the image of a general manager refusing to watch games live, checking the score on pager while working out, it sounds almost too cinematic to be real, but it was absolutely true. Whenever Billy watched his own team in person, he became emotional and subjective. And that was dangerous. It could lead to impulsive decisions that completely undermined the rational system he had built. And even more ridiculous movie-like habit of driving endless circles around stadium parking lot in an SUV during games, that part was real too. Billy's main goal before the season started was simple: build a team that could survive until summer, when the trade market would heat up again. The roster Billy and Paul assembled didn't immediately start performing miracles on the field. Quite the opposite. When New York Yankees arrived in late April, Oakland stood at 11 wins and 8 losses. 3 weeks later, the team had more losses than wins and was still collapsing. The front office was furious. Billy Beane responded with a complete purge. He sent starting first baseman Carlos Pena, second baseman Frank Minchino, starting pitcher Eric Helios, and reliever Jeff Tem down to the minors. Jeremy Jambi was traded to Philadelphia Phillies. In just a few hours, Oakland dumped 3 regular starters, including a Rookie of the Year candidate. The movie suggests Billy exploded at Jeremy Jambi simply because Jambi seemed too cheerful after losses. Reality was a little different, but the core idea was basically the same. Shortly before a series in Toronto, a team had been in Boston where Jeremy Jambi made a mistake. Reporters spotted him partying at a strip club. Suddenly, Jeremy stopped being a machine for getting on base. Now, he was just a 27-year-old player having too much fun on a losing team. Billy immediately started calling teams around the league trying to get rid of him. He barely cared what he got back. The Phillies offered John Mabry, a player Billy barely even knew. "This is probably the worst baseball decision of my life," Billy later told Paul, "but it's the best decision I can make as a general manager." Mabry wasn't one of the Paul's beloved computer-approved players, but then he started hitting home runs, clutch hits, and suddenly the team started winning. At the time of the trade, the Oakland Athletics were 20 wins against 25 losses. 2 months later, they were 60 against 46. Everyone started talking about what a genius Billy Beane was, spotting hidden talent in John Mabry. But the truth was, it wasn't a rational decision at all, it was pure emotion and luck. At this point in the season, Billy barely even needed the whiteboards with player names anymore. He already knew every player he wanted to acquire and every player he wanted gone. The real challenge was convincing other teams to overpay for his players while letting him buy the players he wanted for less than they were actually worth. Remember when I said Oakland's main goal was simply survive until summer? Since 1999, the Oakland Athletics had consistently played very differently after the All-Stars break. The previous season, the split was almost absurd: 44-43 before the break, 58-17 after it. The reason Oakland looked like a completely different team in the second half of every season was simple: they literally became a different team. By midsummer, Billy could finally afford players he had no chance of getting before the season started. The young talents he had identified earlier had gained value, which gave him assets to trade. On July 1st, the division standings looked like this. Oakland was 46 wins, 36 losses, 6 wins from first place. By simply staying competitive, Billy had bought himself access to the trade market. Now, he could go out and acquire whatever pieces the team still needed to reach the playoffs. One of his targets, Ricardo Rincon, would have cost about $500,000 for the remainder of the season. The Oakland's owner Steve Scott didn't want to pay it. To get Rincon, Billy not only had to outbid other teams, he also had to somehow find the money. Billy knew the San Francisco Giants were also chasing Rincon. He also knew the Giants had limited money too, so Billy came up with a plan. If he could convince them to buy a cheaper alternative instead, maybe they'd stop purchasing Rincon altogether. So Billy personally called them and pitched his own player Mike Venafro as the smarter, cheaper option. A perfect move: remove a competitor and raise money for Rincon at the same time. But Billy wasn't done. Like a master salesman, he started offering Venafro to several other teams as well, creating artificial demand around him while quietly lowering the market interest in Rincon. Meanwhile, Billy told Paul to speak with ownership and explain that selling Venafro would cover half of Rincon's cost, and if Billy somehow failed to move Venafro, he was personally willing to cover the difference himself. That was how badly he wanted Rincon. In the end, Venafro was traded to the Texas Rangers and Billy got Rincon. What made the trade even more surreal was the timing. At the exact moment, Rincon was already inside the stadium clubhouse preparing to play against Oakland. Right before game started, he learned he'd been traded and literally walked from one clubhouse to the other. He didn't play that night, the situation was just too emotionally bizarre. There was still one final problem. To activate Rincon, Oakland had to release somebody. The sacrifice became veteran reliever Mike Magnante, so Billy called manager Art Howe. "I've got two pieces of news," Billy told him. "The good news is you've got Ricardo Rincon. The bad news is you need to release Magnante before the game starts." Through all these mid-season trades, Billy acquired several valuable prospects for Oakland's farm system while also strengthening the major league roster with key additions: Ray Durham, Ricardo Rincon, Ted Lilly, and John Mabry. For anyone unfamiliar with baseball, unlike the drafts, trades don't happen all at once. Teams can make trades through most of the season, right up until the trade deadline. By that point, it usually becomes obvious which teams still have playoff hopes and which teams are already out of contention. The contenders try to strengthen their rosters even more, the weaker teams become willing to part with expensive star players. And the closer the deadline gets, the more chaotic the trade market becomes. As I mentioned earlier, trading Jeremy Jambi for John Mabry had already improved Oakland dramatically. But after Billy acquired Ricardo Rincon and Ray Durham, the team went from merely good to historic. Over the previous 50 years, only one team had posted a better second half record, and that team was the Oakland Athletics themselves the year before. By September 4th, 2002, the division standings looked like this. Oakland was first with 87 wins and 51 losses. Anaheim had won 13 of the last 19 games and still lost ground because Oakland had won 19 straight. They had tied the American League record and were now chasing 20th consecutive victory, something no team had accomplished in 100 years. Paul had already calculated the odds of winning 20 games in a row, roughly 14 in a million. Billy had absolutely no intention of watching the game where his team might make history. To him it was just another game. He planned to give a couple interviews and then leave to watch a minor league game instead. But on his way out, the Athletics marketing department stopped him. They couldn't believe the man who built this team was about to leave right now, during what was probably the franchise's biggest chance in years to gain national attention. Billy stayed, and he was furious about it. He gave interviews to CBS, CNN, ESPN and everyone else. Then, as usual, he hid in the gym, away from both the media and the game itself. Somewhere between the treadmill and the exercise bike, he glanced at the television screen. Bottom of the third inning, 11-0, Oakland. For the first time in a while, Billy relaxed. Sweating through his workout clothes, he settled into manager Art Howe's empty office and turned on the TV. After 19 straight wins and with an 11-0 lead against one of the worst teams in baseball, the game felt safe. Nothing could possibly go wrong. Even when the score tightened to 11-5, Billy remained calm on the outside, but now he was alert. Art Howe looked toward the dugout bench. He was looking for Chet Bradford. Billy had specifically instructed him beforehand: if game is on the line, Bradford pitches. Normally, Chet entered during tense, high-pressure situations, but tonight was different. Tonight, history itself was on the line. And Chet Bradford was yet another Oakland player with something unusual about him. From the stretch position, he didn't lean backward like most pitchers. Instead, he bent sharply at the waist, almost like some old-fashioned dance move. His arm whipped forward and downward, nearly scraping the dirt. The ball left his fingers just inches above the ground. In slow motion, it looked less like pitching and more like feeding pigeons or rolling dice. His father had suffered serious arm problems and physically couldn't raise his arm overhead, so he learned to throw sidearm. Young Chet copied the motion growing up. Bradford entered the game and immediately demonstrated how quickly baseball can erase even the biggest lead. Earlier that day, Art had already told Scott Hatteberg he wouldn't play, so Hatteberg had already consumed 4 cups of coffee, leaving him completely wired. At some point, he'd even started chatting with a random guy who showed him homemade baseball bats. Hatteberg liked the way one of them felt in his hands. Like most professional players, he had signed an equipment deal back in the minors and was contractually obligated to use only approved bats. Confident he wouldn't enter the game, he secretly brought the illegal bat into the dugout anyway. And now, with the biggest game in franchise history suddenly collapsing, Art Howe called on Hatteberg after all. Scott grabbed the strange bat he had never actually used before, breaking the contract and not caring anymore. As he stepped into the batter box, he made himself a promise: don't swing low until there are 2 strikes. Wait for your pitch. He was hunting for something higher in the zone, something he could drive into the gap for a double. Hatteberg ignored the first awkward pitch. The second pitch came in fast but high. Hatteberg made a short, compact swing. The ball met the exact center of the bat and flew deep into the right center field. He takes off running almost automatically, like a player who thinks he just mishit the ball and is about to get out. He doesn't notice the opposing team raging in frustration, the stadium exploding in noise, or his teammates already pouring into the field. He still doesn't realize he just hit a historic home run that will live forever in baseball history. The only person in the stadium who doesn't know where the ball is going is the man who hit it. Scott Hatteberg watches the flight of the ball almost indifferently. The ball doesn't just leave the field, it lands deep in the stands, nearly 50 feet beyond the 362-foot marker in the right center field. When Hatteberg finally realizes it's a home run, he raises his hands more in disbelief than celebration. He looks toward the dugout, but nobody's there anymore. Everyone has already stormed the field. The Athletics had won their historic 20th consecutive game and entered baseball history forever. But the season wasn't over yet. Across all of Major League Baseball, only the New York Yankees won as many games as Oakland. After losing Jason Giambi, the team had been written off completely. Instead, they won 103 games, one more than previous season. Even more remarkable, especially economically, was the final order of division standings. By the time the playoffs began, everybody finally understood what Billy and Paul had been doing. The success of low-budget team built around the underrated talent triggered massive debates, but the old baseball establishment fought back hard. Despite Oakland's incredible results, almost everyone still insisted the team played the wrong way. Television analysts consistently argued that playoffs baseball required more aggressive, more visually exciting offense. Billy Beane started worrying that even his own players and coaches might begin believing it. So he showed them the numbers. Their upcoming opponent, the Minnesota Twins, looked more impressive on the field. Their hitters swung harder, hit more dramatically and played a more traditional style, but over the course of the season they had actually scored fewer runs than Oakland. Oakland's offense wasn't as pretty, it was simply more efficient. But once the playoffs began, it felt like the entire baseball world wanted to prove Billy Beane's system didn't work. Nobody pushed that narrative harder than legendary commentator Joe Morgan. He repeatedly told viewers that Oakland didn't know how to manufacture runs in the right way in important games. In 2002, the first playoffs round was best-of-5 series. Oakland faced the Minnesota Twins. The Athletics lost Game 1 7-5, then answered in Game 2 with a 9-1 win. In Game 3, Oakland took the lead in the series, winning 6-3, but Minnesota struck back in Game 4, crushing them 11-2. And then came the deciding Game 5. Oakland lost by 1 run, 5-4. A year earlier, Oakland has lost to the wealthy, star-studded Yankees. But Minnesota wasn't a super team, they were another small-market club very similar to Oakland, and during the regular season they were generally considered the weaker team. Surprisingly, Billy Beane handled the playoff collapse very calmly. Before Game 2 against the Twins, someone asked why he seemed so detached, why he wasn't pacing around the parking lot with his little white box like usual. Billy answered, "My system doesn't work in the playoffs. My job is to get us there. After that, it's just damn luck." Michael Lewis, the author of Moneyball, makes a similar point in the book. Over a long enough timeline, and skill reveals itself. But in a short playoff series, 3 or 4 wins, absolutely anything can happen. Science gives you an advantage, but randomness can still overwhelm it. Personally, I think best-of-5 series is actually enough to determine who's better. A longer series would probably eliminate almost any chance for weaker teams to upset giants by catching them on a bad day. And that doesn't contradict Billy Beane's philosophy at all. It doesn't prove the old baseball establishment was right. Statistics really do provide enormous advantages over the long run, but sports also require character and the ability to survive the biggest moments under pressure. The teams and players who combine elite numbers with mental toughness become champions. At the end of the season, a season many people now bizarre viewed as a failure, all Paul DePodesta could say was, "I hope they keep believing our approach doesn't work, that will give us a few more years of advantage." Ironically, it was Paul himself who late at night after Game 5 smashed a chair with a baseball bat inside the video room. Billy's rational perspective on the playoffs loss didn't last long either. What truly bothered him was the idea that because they lost to a bigger team, nobody would fully appreciate what they actually accomplished. Billy started feeling like he had hit a ceiling. They had squeezed the absolute maximum out of a low-budget team and almost nobody cared. The only thing people focused on was how you performed in the lottery known as the playoffs. But professionals around baseball absolutely noticed. The new owners of Toronto Blue Jays, Rogers Communications, made it clear the franchise needed to become financially self-sustaining. Their CEO, Paul DePodesta, has no baseball background whatsoever, so he approached the sport purely rationally. "Everyone kept saying the same thing," he later recalled. "It always came down to give me Yankees-level money and I'll build a winner." Across all of baseball, Godfrey found only one exception to that mindset – Billy Beane's Oakland Athletics. At first, Godfrey assumed Billy himself was unavailable because of his long-term contract, so instead he offered the general manager position of Blue Jays to Paul DePodesta. Paul declined. Then Godfrey hired the next man down the chain, J.P. Ricciardi, Oakland's director of player development. Ricciardi flew to Toronto for the interview and reportedly got the job in about 5 minutes. Meanwhile, John Henry has just purchased the Boston Red Sox and decided to rebuild the franchise using Oakland's model. In late October, he hired Bill James as a senior advisor. "I don't understand why nobody hired him earlier," Henry said. One thing led to another, and soon Billy Beane agreed to become the general manager of Red Sox. Boston offered him 5 years and $12.5 million, a record contract for a general manager. He hadn't officially signed yet, but it already felt like a formality. Billy had negotiated his release from Oakland and had already started mentally rebuilding the Red Sox. Inside Oakland, rumors about his departure spread quickly. Paul DePodesta agreed to become a new general manager with David Frost as his assistant. Billy and Paul had even agreed that Oakland's compensation for losing Billy would be Kevin Yokelis, the very first player Paul's system had identified and Oakland scouts had dismissed, a player with the highest on-base percentage in all of professional baseball outside of Barry Bonds. All that remained was signing the contract with Boston, and Billy couldn't do it. He realized the only reason he had accepted the offer was to prove that his talent had real value, monetary value. But now he had already proven it. Every sports column in America was talking about Billy Beane becoming the highest paid general manager in baseball history, and once the world recognized his value, he no longer felt the need to prove anything. The only reason left to take the job was the money itself. The next morning, Billy called John Henry and said he couldn't go through with it. A few hours later, he gave journalists a quote that perfectly summed up his entire story. "I've already made one decision for money once, when I signed with Mets instead of going to Stanford, and I promised myself I'd never do that again." Billy Beane's Oakland Athletics became pioneers in using undervalued statistics to build teams. Over the following years, analytical departments began appearing in almost every professional team sport. They evaluated prospects, improved tactics, optimized player development, and searched for hidden advantages. Analysts became part of coaching staff and in many cases eventually became head coaches themselves. Yes, just like in Billy's story, richer clubs can still afford proven superstar players who combine elite numbers with charisma and experience. But even for those teams, statistics became essential for building the most efficient possible system. Today, in many sports, players wear GPS tracking vests that monitor movement, speed, heart rate, and workload. Coaches know who recovers faster, who isn't working hard enough, who is close to injury. Modern tracking cameras constantly record player positioning, ball movement, spacing angles, and dozens of other metrics in real time. And before we finish, here's one very clear example of how analytics changed the entire sport. Before the 2010s, the NBA was filled with mid-range jump shots. Stars constantly attacked through difficult contest two-pointers. Then analysts stopped judging shots by how beautiful they looked and started asking a different question: how many points does each type of shot actually produce on average? If a player hits a mid-range two-pointer 45% of the time, that averages only 0.9, less than 1 point per possession. Three-pointers go in less often, roughly 35% of the time, but they worth more, 3 points, which means they actually produce more points per attempt. One of the first teams to fully embrace this idea was the Houston Rockets. They almost completely abandoned mid-range shots, either attack the rim or shoot threes, and it worked. Today, almost the entire league plays some variation of that system. So take a look at whatever it is you personally do. Maybe statistics can help make you more efficient too. And that's it for today. This ended up being my longest video yet. If you enjoyed it, support the video with a like and a comment. This was Nikita. See you again soon. By the way, if you are interested in sports movies, I have a video about true story from the movie Battle of the Sexes about the famous tennis match between a man and a woman.